So when we talk about a complex sale, a sales process that require, more than just a 5-minute conversation with a prospect for them to buy your product or service, that complex sales usually actually consists not of one sale, but actually of 3 sales. And this is what we call the 3-sale sale. And the 3 sales are as follows, and they're as follows in this exact order. It's not like you can do sale number 2 and then number 1 and then number 3. You have to do sale number 1 first, sale number 2 second, and sale number 3 third. And you should actually develop a sales process that allows you to achieve these 3 sales as you progress on a sales process. Now, your sales process may be just one conversation or one meeting of 1 hour. Even so, you have to design your meeting agenda so that you can achieve these 3 sales as you progress. So sale number 1 is you're selling on your prospect's question on why change. Right? I'm going about my life. If I had a choice, I would decide to continue doing what I'm doing. People tend to prefer status quo. It's only when there's a significant enough reason to change that they would decide to complicate their lives and try another solution, try another way of doing things. So the first thing you need to break is the why change. Once you get someone to agree with you that they need to change the way they do things today, that's when you move to the conversation about what you should change to, right? You should change. What should you change to what you should change to? That's sale number 2. Once you achieve that, that's when you start talking about specifically how you're different, right? This is when you sell against competitors. Now, many of us make the mistake, and we're going to talk about, as we progress today, we're going to talk more about how we tend to move quickly to sale number 2 and sale number 3, and not invest enough time. We don't invest enough time on the sale number 1. That's the main problem that most salespeople and most sales teams have. That's the main error everybody makes, is you don't spend enough time on the sale number 1 and progress too quickly to talk about, what you should change to. This is what you should be doing. This is what you should be doing it with me. You haven't yet anchored a necessity for change with your prospect. So with that said, the agenda for today is we're going to talk a little bit more about this sales story, this story of the 3 sales, and how we can use it to generate traction and start every sales process with the right foot. And hopefully we can cover this in the first 35 minutes. I want to leave the last 10 to 15 minutes to do a quick workshop on how to be better positioned as individuals, as companies, to break the status quo of our buyer persona. So that in mind, who's ready to get started on the chat? 1 to 10, 10 being, I'm dying to get started, Jose, please let's go. 1 being, I'm considering leaving. 1 to 10, how excited, oh my God, Caleb, he's an 11. I love it. All right, let's go. So first is your sales story. And when I talk about the sales story, I like to talk about when is it important, why is it important? And I start with a scenario. And the scenario is the following. You're in that first conversation. Oh man, the 10 keep coming. I love it. You're in that first interaction with your prospect buyer, your ideal buyer persona. And for many of you, it may be a C-level executive. It may be someone else. It may be the director of IT. It could be something else, right? But you're in the connect call. You're in the first interaction with your ideal buyer persona. So let's say it's a C-level executive in a company in your target market. Usually, and you probably experienced this before, is toward the beginning of the conversation, that first interaction, right? First thing that your prospects ask is, well, yay, daddy, what is that you do? What do you do? Right? They ask us what you do. And what do we usually respond with? If you can use the chat, if they ask you what do you do, and let me ask this question differently. If they ask you what you do, why do they ask you what you do? Is it because they want to know what you do, or is it something else? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they ask you, what do you do? Why do they a It's the first 5 minutes of knowing someone. Oh, I love what James said there, right? They want to know if you're worth spending their time with. Right? They're trying to figure out, they don't want to know what you do, right? It's too early in the conversation to know what you do. In the first 5 minutes of conversation, and today probably it's going to be like a video conference or a phone call, the first 5 minutes, what they're really trying to ascertain is, should I be investing my time with this person? What is in it for me to be with you, to be working with you, to be speaking with you? And the problem is when they ask us what we do, we respond with what we do. And that is a mistake, right? What we need to respond is the actual question that they want answered, which is it relevant for me to be speaking with you right now? And that has nothing to do with what you do. That has to do with them. So when they ask you what you do, the way you answer is with your sales story. You first highlight what problems you address and for whom. Not what solutions you have. It's what problems do you address and for whom. And to be quite honest, I would limit my response to this point number 1, which we call the sales positioning statement. The first 5 minutes of conversation, when someone asks me, Jose, what do you do? I don't respond with what I do, with my solution or why I'm different. I respond with, this is the problem that I usually address, and this is the people that I solve that problem for. I limit my response to that. And this is actually what we're going to focus on today. Why change, why now? When they ask me what I do, it's actually an opportunity for me to start working on breaking that status quo. And I do that by highlighting a problem. So this is what we're going to focus on today. What problems do I address and for whom? And the way I describe it is I need to really make it all about the prospect first. Now, to be able to make it all about the prospect first, I need to really clearly define who do I help specifically and what do I help them specifically with, right? I've received a LinkedIn email about a month ago, and someone was pitching their product. And I actually genuinely asked them, what problem do you solve and for whom? To kind of ascertain if it was in my interest to continue that conversation. He couldn't answer. He said, well, this is what we do. And this is my solution. This is what the solution looks like. And like, man, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, what is a problem that you're trying to solve and for whom specifically? You can't solve every problem for everyone. It makes it really hard for people to understand if you're relevant for them. It also makes it really hard for you to communicate more effectively with your market. So focus on your prospect first. When they ask you what you do, you respond with what problems you address for whom. And I'm going to show you a longer format of a template for this answer that you can use on conversation or on your prospecting emails later. But the overall kind of a structure is the following. We typically work with, and that's where you describe your ideal persona, who, and then you describe their goals, but have these challenges, right? So persona, goals, and challenges. Those are the 3 components, main components of your answer. So if you take nothing else out of today's session, one thing that I hope you come out with today as you return to your business and you return to growing your startups and your businesses is start describing what you do by focusing on the problem you solve and for whom you solve it, not on what you do, not on what your product does or how it works, but the problem you're solving. So once you have that, the tip number 2 for answering with your sales positioning statement is add some specifics to give it some bite. Now, again, if you have a clearly defined target market, a clearly defined persona that is not everything for everyone, it's going to make it much easier to have something very specific to give. So for example I'm talking about, I work with this type of person who have these goals, but encounter these challenges. I can give it some bite by adding specifics. Usually they've tried doing this, but it hasn't worked. Now, as you continue to kind of elaborate on that response, and it's not a long response, it's less than 30 seconds, you start becoming clearly relevant for your prospect. Now I'll give you an example, because I know this is out of kind of all theoretical. Let's say I'm talking about HubSpot, and I say, well, I work with directors of marketing, and let's say I just work with the mid-market section of our business. I work with directors of marketing at mid-market companies with about 100 to 500 employees that are trying to respond to the current situation, whose teams are used to connecting with their prospects in person and are struggling with connecting with them in the online channels, and it's become a real problem for them connecting and generating demand for the sales teams, because they don't know how to do it via online channels, with their website and the social media. They've tried maybe doing a Facebook campaign here and there. Maybe they've tried doing a LinkedIn ad campaign. They've maybe tried or invested in creating content to see if they rank organically and generate demand that way. But none of that has been working. They've invested a ton of money and time and resources to generate demand online for their sales teams, and it's not working, right? So that's very specific. This person should know right then and right there if I am relevant for them right now. Now, I'm not talking about what I do. I'm just talking about what is the problem, what are the goals of the person I'm trying to help, and what are the problems and challenges that they're encountering on their way. And this is an example from one of our partners who went through this session and kind of worked on the homework I left them, and he came up with this sales positioning statement that he used with his market. And it reads something like this. We work with sales managers at manufacturers who are frustrated that the marketing department is wasting money, and basically their leads suck. Now, question for you. Who thinks this is a great sales positioning statement, and who thinks they don't like it? Like, whom of you will use this one, or whom of you would say, never in my life would I use a positioning statement like this, and why? On the chat. Would you use this? Yes or no? Do you think it's effective? Yes or no? And why? Bonnie says, no way. It's too negative, too aggressive. No, because that's basically every sales team. They hate their marketing teams. All right? Not specific enough. Yes and no? Well, it depends on who you're talking, right? If you're talking with a sales manager and you're empathizing with their not liking their marketing team and what they do, that may be great. But if someone from the marketing team is in that meeting and is hearing you speak, you're throwing them under the bus, says Morgan, and that may not work. So it really, again, goes back to who your persona is. For some of you, especially if by any chance you are working in the manufacturing world, and I worked in the manufacturing world, I'm an industrial engineer, and before I came into technology, I worked in manufacturing. And when I first read this, my reaction was, man, this is perfect. This is exactly the language of sales managers at manufacturing companies. It's very aggressive, right? They don't measure their words too much. They're very aggressive in general, right? And so this type of wording actually resonates with that very specific market, sales managers at manufacturers. So when Rob used this in a manufacturer-only network group with other salespeople, they actually loved it. Some people approach them and say, hey man, like, I want to work with you. What you described is exactly what's going on with me. And from there, he created a sales opportunity and a client just because he was able to connect emotionally with his very specific target market. So my point with all of this is, when you're thinking about this response, this sales positioning statement, not only consider the words, the goals, the challenges, also consider emotion as you're writing this, right? Like if I were to write a sales positioning statement for the director of IT at a large bank probably wouldn't use this wording, right? Like it wouldn't work. But it is okay to be a bit bold if you're clear on who your persona is, and as much as you can, try to incorporate emotion, empathy in your answer on what problems you address and for whom, right? So that's tip number 3. And some of the readings that are in addition to today's session that I recommend you kind of looking into if you're interested in this topic on how do you use emotion, how do you incorporate emotion in your sales. These 3 books actually have been very, very helpful for me. One is Predictably Irrational, talks about behavioral economics a little bit. Science of Selling, again, a little bit of like social studies behind how people react to stuff like scarcity and how you phrase things, right? Like it's not what you say, it's how you say it type of thing. Science of Selling goes into that, and Influence also goes a little bit into behavioral science. So these 3 books can help you understand how kind of people react to not only what's being said, but how it's being said, so that you can incorporate it in your sales positioning statement. And the final thing, the final component of all this is, so we have focus on prospect first, add specifics to add some bite, add emotion. And the 4th thing is add a question, end your answer with a question. And this is crucial, right? Something like, does this resonate with you? Does this sound like you, Morgan? Like, has this happened to you, Caleb? That's how I finish my response to the question, what do you do? It's really, really important to this because it returns the focus of the conversation on the prospect where it should be, right? When you're connecting with a new prospect because you think they're going through whatever context you think that made you think, okay, I can help this person, I can help this company. They seem to be going through this problem that I actually can help solve. When you're connecting with that person, that conversation should not be about you and what you do and how you can help them. We already established I'm relevant for your life with my answer. Now we should be talking about what specifically are you going through, Mrs. Prospect, for us both to ascertain if we should continue talking and if actually I can help you. So we should bring the focus back to the prospects and we should be the ones asking questions. So before we move on to like the template that I want to share with you today, so I want to give you an assignment for this week, and it's already Tuesday, so we have 3 days. And of course, it's optional. I'm not going to be tracking it, but if you do, send me an email. If you have success, send me an email. I'd love to hear the story. The assignment is the following. When you're describing who you help with and with which problems, and you're doing the sales positioning statement, if you get a prospect to tell you, hey, that's exactly me, that sounds a lot like us. Or even if you get them nodding like, man, you're right. That is exactly what's going on here. If you get that sort of response, that's a win. Send me an email. I'd love to hear that story. That's what you need to accomplish. Someone saying, that's me. No, oh, that's a great solution. That sounds interesting. That's very impressive. Those are not the type of reactions you want on that first conversation. The first reaction you want is, you're right. We're not doing things right. We're in trouble if we don't change our status quo. Those are the types of reactions you're looking for in that first interaction. So this is a template, right? It's 5 components. One is we describe specifically who we help with. Now in this template example, I'm using CEOs at professional services companies, right? CEOs or C-level executives, directors of sales, at manufacturing companies, right? Principals at elementary schools, public elementary schools, right? Very different for everyone. So make sure you clearly define not only the type of company you help with, but the type of role at the company. One of the mistakes that I've seen done is people would say something like, we help public schools deliver their content online through these difficult times. You're not helping the public school, you're helping someone at the public school. So who's that someone you're helping? That's going to be much more tangible if you can describe the actual person you're helping. So that's point number one. Point number two is you're going to describe, and this is in this template, it's really short, so it's not, you know, as impressive, but basically you're going to describe their goals in a positive framework, right? And this is why it's highlighted in green. Who are serious about growth, who are investing in growth, who are shooting for a 50% revenue growth this year or in the next 2 years, right? A goal and a common goal that your ideal buyer persona has in a positive light. They're trying to increase the amount of demand they generate for the sales teams online. They're trying to reduce the cost of acquisition of their new customers by engaging them through online channels, whatever that goal is, in a positive manner. And then you're going to switch to their challenges using a transition word like frustrated. So you're using emotion there, and then you're going to describe their challenges in a negative framework. So goals in a positive framework. I know you're trying to do this great thing, and that's great for you. I'm happy for you. Thing is, you're probably not being able to achieve that goal because this is getting on your way, right? You're serious about generating more online demand for your business, but you're frustrated because you've spent time, money, effort, resources on your website and other marketing tactics, and you still are not producing the level of demand and the quality of demand that your sales team needs to achieve their quotas. Does that happen to you? And that's aspect number 5. The number 5 component of this template is that question at the end. So persona, CEOs at professional services company, that's number 1. 2, the goal in a positive framework. 3, that transition word like frustrated, right? You want to elicit emotion. Component number 4 is their challenges in a negative framework. And component number 5 is that question at the end to switch the conversation, right? Remember how this whole thing started. First 2 minutes of a conversation, they asked me, what do I do? If I answer and add traffic and leads they had hoped for and stop there, what's going to happen right after that? What's my prospect going to say right after that? What do you think? So most likely, if you've been in this situation, most likely what's going to happen is they're going to ask you another question. Like, who do you work with? Who are some of your clients? How much does this cost? Right? You want to avoid that kind of line of questioning. That's not productive for you or for the prospect. So again, use that question at the end to change the dynamic of the conversation. Traffic and leads they had hoped for, does that sound like what you're going through? And they're going to say something like, yes, a little bit. Oh, tell me more about it. Well, blah, 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 blah. Oh, tell me more about it. Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. So now you're in the position where you're asking questions and they're answering. And it's not a manipulative thing. It's actually what's required to have a productive conversation. Right? You're here to understand what they need help with. So that's the template for answering the question, what do you do? Now, with that said, see how we're doing on time. We're doing great on time. I'm going to skip on this role play. I want to use this at the end, this time at the end, to do another role play. And just want to remind you of the 4 pro tips when developing that answer, that sales positioning statement. What do you do? Okay, focus on your prospect first. What problems are you solving for them and for whom specifically? Why are those problems meaningful to solve, right? What happens if you don't address those issues? Is the world going to end? Is your world going to end? Are you going to get fired? Is the company going to go bankrupt? If you don't address those problems, are they important to, is it going to have a negative consequence in the short term or even in the long term? Be bold, use emotion and logic. Remember, sales managers at manufacturing companies, they have a certain language they use, right? Try to mimic that a little bit. Oh, sorry, and number 4 is end with a question. All this work of having a great answer to the question, what do you do? If you don't end with a question, believe me, what's going to happen next is you're going to get another question and you're going to be on the defensive, and that's not going to be productive. You're just basically trying to justify yourself, to prove yourself. And neither you or the prospect know if they actually have a problem that you can help with, and if they're trying to solve it, and if they're going to let themselves be helped. So, you know, being on the defensive, trying to prove yourself, trying to show your credentials, that's irrelevant at this point in the conversation. So again, answer or end your answer with a question. Now, before we move on to the workshop on status quo, want to do a quick quiz here, and we won't do a poll question. We'll just use the chat. So question number one is, let's see here. There you go. Question number one is, what are the 3 sales in the 3 sales cell? And if you don't remember the 3, which is the first one? What's the number 1 sale in the 3 sales cell? Who remembers? Problems you address and for whom? James Bell. Excellent. Excellent. You get a virtual chocolate from Jose going your way. Why change? To what and how? Excellent, Walter. Man, you get a half a Snicker bar. I love it. I love it. The problem, right? So sell the change first, status quo, selling against the status quo first, then the solution, right? How do you solve that problem? And you try to highlight your solution as the best of all the alternative solutions to solve the problem. And 3, how, right? How do you execute on that specific solution? By doing it with us, with our expertise, with the specific way we actually do it. So if you go back to the problem being a company that is not growing enough, fast enough, which the sales are not growing fast enough or are declining, and they're trying to solve that problem, they need to change. Let's say they agree, we need to change the way we do things. If we keep doing it that way, we're going to keep declining in sales. So we need to do something different. So that's sale number 1. Solution could be, I will just hire more salespeople, right? That is one solution. This happens a lot in like real estate. If you ever sell into the real estate market or industry, one of the ways the real estate industry reacts to slowing down in sales is they hire more salespeople, because most of them pay 100% on commission. So it costs them nothing to hire more salespeople. That is one solution. The other solution could be, hey, what if you generated more demand through online channels by people doing research of when to move or where to move, or the size of the apartment they should be going to, or which neighborhood they should be going to. So maybe online, through content, through a great website, you could actually connect with your demand. So that's another solution. And once they're sold on that, they can solve the problem of declining sales with connecting with their target market and generating demand online. Then I'm going to say, well, the way you do that is through something called inbound marketing. That's the best way to connect long-term and generate long-term growth in sales and demand generation for your business. This is how we do it at HubSpot. We've been doing it for 15 years, and we've developed this software tool that allows you to do it very effectively. So that will be cell number 3, right? So again, 3 sales on the 3 sales cell. What is an example of a common pothole a startup or any company might fall into while navigating the 3 sales cell? We spoke about this, right? What is the number 1 mistake salespeople and sales teams do as they navigate the 3 sales cell? In the chat. Who remembers? Number 1 mistake most people make. Those are good answers. That's not the biggest mistake teams do, right? Erhan has it, right? These are all things you mentioned. They're mistakes or things that are important to do. The biggest mistake is moving to cell number 2. This happens all the time. Whenever there's silence, whenever we feel we don't have better questions to ask, when we move into the solution, this is what you should be doing, Mrs. Prospect, Mr. Prospect. This is how you should be doing things before we continue to ask questions about the problem and making that problem and making status quo painful. If we don't do that painful enough, we're not going to close that deal. We may move to cell number 2. We may move that deal further down the line, What happens is if you move fast on your sales process and you don't qualify enough, you're going to move fast on your sales process, and then your closing is going to be very slow, right? It's going to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of people who like disappear, stop answering questions. They don't have urgency to act. All those things tie back to not doing a great job on sale number one. So number one pothole to avoid in sales is move on from sale number one until it's done. And the first element of your sales story addresses the pains and problems of our prospects. What is this concept referring to? Is this a sales positioning statement, the differentiation statement, or the statement of solution? That's a pretty easy one, sales positioning statement. All right, so with that said, we have about 20 minutes left. I want to use the next 10 minutes to do an exercise, right? We're talking a lot today about how do we break status quo with our prospect. And we have this answer to when they ask us what we do. Now, in my experience, and as I've been learning how to deal specifically with this problem of how do we break status quo with our prospects, one of the things that I found along the way was this resource by a sales author and a sales speaker named Jill Conrad. I don't know if you've heard of Jill Conrad. She has a couple of books out there. She's really good. Not associated with HubSpot. I don't know her. I just found her content online once. I've read about her. I read the content and it was very helpful when I used it. So Jill Conrad has, if you Google Jill Conrad Buyer's Matrix, you're going to get into these, you're probably going to get this landing page here. And it's basically a worksheet. It's basically a series of questions you can ask yourself about your prospect so you have a more defined definition of who you're selling to. Now, many of you know this as a buyer persona, like developing a buyer persona, and HubSpot has actually great resources for developing a buyer persona. What I really like about Jill Conrad's content or her worksheet is not so much the first few questions are very similar to when you're developing a buyer persona. What I really like is her last 3 questions when she's asking you about your target persona, your ideal buyer profile. The last 3 questions on that file, and you can go, again, Jill Conrad Buyer's Matrix, and I'll send you the slides later and download it. It'll be kind of like a PDF. The last 3 questions are these ones. And these actually address your understanding of what the status quo is for your prospect. You really need to get under the hood. You need to get into the head of your prospect and understand the mechanics. Oh, thank you, Erhan. Erhan shared the link on the chat. And these 3 questions really help you understand how status quo mechanics work with your prospect and how to address them. The first one is, well, you first need to describe their status quo, right? Not the problem they have, who they are, like all those things are answered in previous questions in this format, but it's basically, how do they do things today, right? How do they do things today? And why do you think doing these things this way are a problem, right? So how do they do things today, and why do you think it's a problem? Now, why you think it's a problem is not going to be as relevant in the conversation in the beginning, but understanding how they do things today is really going to help you understand, okay, how likely, because of how they do things today, how likely are they to stay in status quo? How comfortable are they with status quo? And what are some signals, right? And that's the second question. What are some signals? What are some events, triggers that would cause your persona, your ideal buyer, to change from the status quo? What are some events? Like, I'll give you an example. I was talking with a startup who does alternative energy solutions, and it's basically backup energy for companies who have high value inventory, like hospitals and their medicines and the vaccines and everything like that. That has a high cost, if you run out of electricity and you don't have refrigerators for the medicine, there's a high cost associated with if you run out of electricity. So a trigger event is if there's a widespread outage of electricity in a certain area, there's a very specific trigger that would cause the buyer persona for this startup to be more open to exploring, changing the way they do backup electricity, right? If you run out of electricity, that's when you start thinking, man, I should really have a backup here if this happens again. So what are some of these trigger events? This will help you with a couple of things. One is, as you're exploring and having a conversation with your prospect, it can help you highlight signals that your prospect may have missed, that the way they do things today are not the right way to do things. The second is, as you're researching who to connect with, if you're doing prospecting and sourcing of new leads, you're looking for these signals out there, right? Like changes in microeconomic situation, specific news about, target accounts that you're pursuing. If you're more sensitive to these trigger moments, trigger events, it's going to make it much, much easier for you to source new deals. But the most important aspect of this is, these are the things that need to happen for your prospect to start considering doing things differently. And they either need to be happening, or you need to ask if they've noticed those things happening as you're doing the conversation with them. So that's number 2. Number 3, and one point of advice on number 2, change drivers. When I do this exercise in this workshop with startups, when I've done it in the past, most people highlight change drivers, so triggers that would cause a prospect to change to a solution. And what you really want to do here is triggers that will cause your prospect to change from their status quo. Not that your solution becomes more desirable, it's more that your current status quo becomes more of a problem, right? Again, solution is irrelevant at this point, is status quo. What is causing the status quo to become unbearable, right? I need to change how I'm doing things. I don't know to what, but I need to change. So that's question number 2. Question number 3 is, and this is a very tricky one to answer, and if your background is in engineering, I know Varun, I don't know if he's still there, I know Varun, his background as mine is in engineering. And for us, intuitively, especially early on in our careers, it was really difficult to deal with illogical behavior, illogical reasoning, right? 1 + 1 = 2. The thing that happens when you go, right, Varun? The thing that happens when you go into sales, and we've learned this as we moved into business, is there's a lot of irrationality going on. And one of the most difficult irrational behaviors to deal with as a sales professional is when your prospect understands that what they do and how they do things is not the right way, that they're going to be in trouble if they keep doing it that way. And yet, even though they know they should not change, they should not stay with their status quo, they still decide to stay in it. That's a really hard to answer. If you answer this question, you're going to reduce the threshold of action of your prospects. By threshold of action, I mean people may understand that something needs to be done, but what's that level that you need to get to where they say, I know I need to change it, and now I'm in a point where I am actually going to do something about it. So, and I always like to use this example regarding threshold of action. Is I used to live in Seattle for a while before I moved back to Boston. And in Seattle, like there's no snow like in Boston. There's no very low temperatures like there's in Boston. So when I moved back to Boston 5 years ago, my shoes consisted on a collection of Converse shoes of all different colors. On my first winter in Boston, I kind of knew that the Converses, when you're like at -1 or -5 Fahrenheit, the Converse shoes are not great. And when it's snowing and icy outside and you're walking on ice, the Converse shoes are not great. So my first winter wasn't that fun when I was walking on my Converse shoes. And I knew I had to change my shoes for the winter. I knew I needed to get snow boots. But when I looked at the price of the snow boots, man, like those things are like a decent one is like $80, $100 for a really nice pair of boots for the snow. So even though I wasn't comfortable walking on Converses on snow, I wasn't uncomfortable enough to invest $100 on boots. So it really needed to happen where I kind of slipped and kind of hurt myself a little bit. I didn't break anything, but I hurt myself a little bit. And that I said, you know what, now I will invest $100 in the boots. So my threshold of action was surpassed, and my logical and my irrational kind of mindset kind of agreed on, you need to get boots. So this happens with change inhibitors, and you need to identify this because you need to bring it up to the attention of your prospect. You also need to create maybe sometimes collateral to help your prospect navigate these change inhibitors, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples of things I've seen done at HubSpot. So HubSpot, right now, when you think of cloud software, you think of it as something kind of like, you know, life as usual. But like 10 years ago, when you asked a bank or a healthcare company to move all their data to the cloud, they were very hesitant about it. Now, let's imagine you have a prospect in the banking industry, and they know they need to generate demand online. They know they need to do inbound marketing. They know they need to do it with HubSpot, but they still won't do it because they're so afraid of moving all the data to the cloud. So that's one of the things that would cause them to stay in the status quo, even if they were not happy with it. They knew they wanted to do HubSpot and inbound, but their fear of moving their data to the cloud was so high that would have stopped them for actually changing status quo. So what we did is we created a whole website talking about how we protect data and how our security protocols work to make sure your data is safe all the time, and all the certification, all the compliance stuff that we go through to make sure that your data is as safe as it can be. So we had to create that. Another thing that happened, and this is when I was selling to Latin America, was people didn't know much about like digital marketing. They knew they couldn't scale if they didn't create demand online, but they were really unsure. Like in Latin America, the cost of opportunity is much higher than in the US. When you buy HubSpot, for example, you spend $1,000 a month on software. Like in the US, that's not cheap. You know, $1,000 a month, it's not like you're going to hire a high-level professional with $1,000 a month in most places in the US. In Latin America, with $1,000, you can hire a team of 3 marketers and really good marketers for your company with $1,000. So the cost of opportunity is really, really high. And so when you're saying, hey, invest $1,000 on software to increase your sales, the first thing a question that a customer has is, well, if I invest $1,000, how much should I expect I will get back after a year of doing this? And that's where we came in, and we had the benefit of having, you know, a decade of data, 80,000 customers' data in aggregation to kind of slice it and dice it and say, well, if you're starting here and you're doing HubSpot and you're doing inbound for a year, this is how much your lead generation increases after 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. And we created this calculator where we will tell you, where are you today? And what should you expect your company to be doing in terms of demand generation and sales increase after 6 months and 12 months? And that will help them calculate the ROI of investing in software. So again, identifying change inhibitors helps us understand what are some of the things we need to address, some of the biggest objections we need to address to help people kind of overcome that threshold of action so that they actually change. With this said, and this was a long explanation, I would love to take 5 minutes and kind of, if you're up to it, if you're interested, go through this exercise the next 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, I'll ask for a volunteer. If someone wants to volunteer, then we'll do that exercise. We'll hear what you had to say, and hopefully you'll get feedback not only from me, but also from other people on the group chat. So next 5 minutes, try to answer the number 1 and number 2. Let's leave number 3 for later because that takes a long time. Number 1 and number 2, the next 5 minutes. Just write it down on a piece of paper and we'll discuss it. I'm gonna leave the questions up there again. And again, as you're going through change drivers, think of what would cause your prospect to change from how they do things today, not what will make your solution more attractive. And if someone is done before the 5 minutes and they want to share, and just raise your hand. I guess not raise your hand, just write on the chat or unmute yourself and let us know what you came up with. And then for those of you looking at your clocks and your watches, and if you have to go to lunch, this is actually the last slide of today. If you have to leave, I understand. Thank you for coming. And if you have questions, if you want to kind of go through this exercise, but you don't have the time to do it right now, you want to send me a quick LinkedIn message, I'll be glad to give you some feedback. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm the only Jose Martins that works at HubSpot. So if you just search Jose Martins HubSpot, you'll go to my profile quickly. So let's connect, and any questions that I can help answer, I'll be glad to. All right, thank you, Jeff. Thank you guys for coming. I know like it's not easy to volunteer in front of a bunch of strangers, but if any of you have come up with the first two questions, answers to the first two questions, I'd love to hear it, and we can debate it in the next 5 minutes.
Jose, I'll break the ice. This is Caleb. So Startup Junkie, we don't sell, but we offer free consulting to innovators and entrepreneurs as our service. So I guess the status quo for a potential Startup Junkie client would be for them to the status quo would be them continuing to go it on their own as an entrepreneur, trying to do things their own way. And then what might cause them to change that status quo would be possibly hitting a pain point that they can't solve themselves.
So what is a very specific pain point that you think can surface during that process?
Could be any number of things. They need access to some sort of resource, or they're having difficulty scaling or something like that. Right,
like sales are stagnant.
Uh-huh.
That could be one. Like, and it's a good exercise because it's difficult to have one answer to this number two question that encompasses everything. So my suggestion, and thank you for sharing, Caleb, my suggestion is create a list. When I was training HubSpot's agency partners on selling inbound, one of those slides on the sales training was, let's create a list of all the trigger events that can happen that signal someone might need your help. And so my suggestion, Caleb, and the rest of the group here is change drivers, list them out. It may be 20, it may be 30, it may be 50, list them out. And like, now that you have those, you can create content around it. You can create ads around those trigger events, or you can actually do research. If you're doing like more of a B2B target account type of selling, you can search for those indicators out there. But Caleb, absolutely. Let's say I'm a startup and I've tried to figure it out by myself, by reading online, looking at free resources. But after a while, I see my sales are just stagnant. Like for the past year, they're stagnant. And question for you, Caleb, how long can my sales be stagnant before I decide to change my approach to how I grow my business?
Well, I advise not waiting too long.
Right? So it depends on, basically, for many startups, and not for all, but one aspect that can help is your run rate, right? So maybe you can create an article or a calculator saying, hey, how do you calculate the run rate for your business, right? And how much your sales need to grow to continue in business for the next 2 years. And maybe that calculator highlights something to the startup where they're like, oh man, if I don't increase my sales by 10% in the next 6 months, I'm going to run out of cash and I'm going to need to go back and look for a job. So that could be one thing. Maybe some startups are receiving like a pre-seed or a grant or some sort of initial round of funding, but they really want to get to Series A funding, and they need to show a 10x increase in sales, and they're not seeing it. And it's been a year. So all these are signals of change. And one of the things that I'm trying to highlight, but I wasn't very explicit about, is when you're thinking about why change, right? We're thinking about status quo as this whole question about why change. Why should you change? The other question that's going to help you a lot, Caleb and the rest of the group, in addressing status quo is not only why change, but most specifically, why now, right? I'm not growing. My sales are not growing. I need to change the way I am approaching my go-to-market. And I've been reading about all these go-to-market techniques and articles, and I still can't quite get it. I need to change. Now, why do I need to do that in like June of 2020 and not in January of 2021? And there is a good question for you to ask yourselves as you're going through a sales process and you feel like that opportunity is not moving forward, it's kind of stuck on that status quo. First, ask yourself, my prospect, what is stopping them? Why wouldn't they wait another year to address this? If you can't answer that for yourself, you need to do something urgently. That's not going to close. But if you do know what that is, then you need to have that conversation with your prospect. Thank you for sharing, Caleb. And I think we're out of time. Thank you all for sharing. Again, I'm at your service. If you have more questions, if you want to kind of address these topics or get some feedback on your sales positioning statement, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be glad to help out. Again, Caleb, thank you for putting this together. I'll send you the slide and the recording so that you can share with everybody who showed up today.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Jose.
Thank you, guys.
Presentation, and thanks everybody for participating.
All righty. Bye-bye. Go Babson, Varun. Go Babson. Bye-bye.